Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone.
Namaste.
Namaste.
I thank our speakers for the elaborate discussion on electrolyte disorders in endocrinology. We now proceed to our next symposium, a symposium on adolescent endocrinology. I would like to welcome our moderators for this session. Dr. Ram is not currently with us, so I would like to introduce our next moderator, Dr. Sivan. Dr. Sivan, sir is consultant endocrinologist at Ponra Hospital, Tirunelveli and NS Hospital, Kollam. Sir has presented various papers in national conferences and has been co-investigators in various clinical trials. To his credit, sir has got various case reports and original papers in national and international papers. Welcome to you, sir. Kindly take over.
So please unmute, sir.
Good morning to all. Good morning to all doctors, colleagues, and all delegates. We have come to the last session of the Trendo 2020. This we are going to discuss about adolescent endocrinology. We have 3 topics and 3 eminent speakers. The first talk will be given by Dr. Sridhar. He has finished his DM endocrinology in PGI Chandigarh, and currently he is associate professor in Madurai Medical College. He has established first government endocrine department in Tamil Nadu, and he has got various publications in national international journals, and he is the best outgoing student in JIPMER in 2008. He is going to discuss about approach to short stature. Over to Dr. Sridhar.
Hope the slide is visible and I'm audible.
Yes, you can go ahead.
So good morning, one and all. At the outset, I would like to thank the Trendo team, Dr. Vijay Bhaskar Reddy, for giving this opportunity to share my views on approach to short stature, as well as I thank my colleague and friend Dr. Sivan for the kind introduction. And I will be discussing regarding how to approach the short stature as a physician's point of view. And I will be discussing regarding the definitions and various growth chart that is available in currently, and what are the various etiology and clinical features when to suspect short stature by the clinical features, because a lot of syndromes also have been involved in short stature, and the investigations and at last management. And first and foremost, the definition of short stature: height below 2 standard deviation or below 3rd centile. It is known as a short stature, and I will discuss in the subsequent slides regarding the growth chart. It will be more clear. And the height should be matched for the age and sex, as well as it should be the population standard. And approximately 3 to 5% of the children in any populations will be short. So from the statistical point of view, that is a 2 standard deviation, less than 5th or more than 95th. So the 2 standard deviations we have to take in account if any population-based statistics we are maintaining. And predominantly 50% are physiological short stature. So we have to be careful, and we have to recognize appropriately to avoid unnecessary treatment. And it may be a familial or constitutional. And it is a symptom basically, and it may not be a disease as such. And you can see that the height velocity, it is one of the important determinant to predict whether it is a physiological short stature or we are dealing with a pathological short stature. And the first and second year is the most important period. Every child has gained almost around 75 from 50 centimeter at birth to it is around 88 centimeter at the second year of life. So the first year is the most the important phase of the growth, and subsequently second year. And the pre-pubertal period, that is almost 3rd year onwards to up to 12th year, it is a quiescent phase. So we may not expect that much amount of spurt, but still we have to carefully follow that child, since we may be able to pick up at the early period of time. And the second peak which is happening during the puberty, that is around 10 to 15 centimeter per year, which is going to happen. That is the physiology. So the in-between period, the approximate height velocities are around 5 to 6 centimeter per year. So after 4 years until puberty, a growth velocity of less than 5 centimeter or less than 4, it is very much significant. So the growth velocity will give you an important clue whether the child is the recent one or it is going to be a long one. And there are various hormones that is involved in the growth. The first and foremost is the growth hormone and subsequently IGF-1. So the IGF-1 growth hormone, it acts through IGF-1 and the thyroid hormones and the sex steroids. It is more essential for the pubertal growth and growth factors. It is involving in the skeletal dysplasia or achondroplasia. So the first 2 years, even though the growth hormone has the important role, the nutrition is also has equally contributed the growth in the first 2 years of life. And subsequently, the quiescent period, the growth hormone is the only hormone that has a more important role. And subsequently, after the 12 years of age, the sex steroids has the role, including the growth hormone. And so as already highlighted that the prepubertal, the growth hormone is the main, and in puberty, which is happening early in a female and which is happening at late, and subsequently the male children, they grow more comparing with the female children. However, the puberty is starting late in a male child. And going to the case approach to the short stature, the history taking is very important, and we should know about the date of birth because we have to exactly pinpoint about the age, that is a chronological age in the growth chart. Hence, we recurring the date of birth and birth weight. So the low birth weight or very low birth weight or small for gestational age, they are more prone to have the short stature in the future from the various studies or various data. And a lot of genetics workup have been happened in India, and the consanguinity also has been involved in the pathogenesis of short stature and delay puberty in parents and family, that is known as a constitutional delay, which is also more important in finding the etiology of short stature and psychosocial issues. And many of the times the father or mother, there is a family issues or where the children is growing, that is also more important in the psychological. And one should not forget to ask about any systemic illnesses like malabsorption syndromes or any underlying cardiovascular illness or bronchiectasis or recurrent bronchial asthma, like that we should rule out. And in developmental delay, anything also we should rule out before undergoing any hormonal test. And for the treatment of bronchial asthma, steroid is one of the most commonly abused drug in almost all segment of populations. This is a child, he came later in delayed puberty with a short stature, with the chronological age of 16 years, with the height age of around corresponding to the 3 years less than the age. So one should not forget about the steroid use. In most common in pediatric populations, the nephrotic syndrome is one of the most common use of steroid, and subsequently bronchial asthma.
Hello, Dr. Sridhar.
Sir, I think Dr. Sridhar's internet got disconnected, so we've lost him for the time being.
Okay. Shall we wait?
We can wait, so we can start with Dr. Bharat. We can wait for 2 minutes, and if he doesn't join, then we can start with the session for now.
Okay. And the third speaker, I'm not seeing him online. Dr. Arun Vishwanath is he joining?
Yes,
Or
sir.
the speaker is changed? Dr.
Right.
Arun Vishwanath.
15 minutes before, 10 to 15 minutes before his session. So like
Okay.
at 12:15 or 12:20, he'll be joining.
Okay. Okay.
Dr. Arun.
And Dr. Ramkumar has joined the session. Let's welcome Dr. Ram Kumar.
Yes, sir, I'm here, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I think Dr. Sridhar is joining.
Yeah, sorry, I have some interruption in the net connections.
Okay. Now
Hope
you're
it is
audible. Yeah, it's audible. Yeah.
So the hydrocortisone may be a preferred agent in growing children. And before going into the clinical details, one should know about how to accurately measure the height. There is a two measurement. That is in infants, it's an infantometer. So everything should be a straight. And here the growing children, that is a stadiometer. And it should be, the three things should be in the same alignment. The occiput, as well as the scapula, as well as the gluteal regions and the heel pad. So it should be in the straight, and it should be adjustable, the movable headpiece. So this is one of the two important thing. And the horizontal level from the auricles to the eye, that is also we should note it. And there is a various growth chart is available, and the most commonly used maybe a Indian chart, as well as we have the other growth charts, that is WHO growth charts and CDC growth chart. And in India, the ICMR, Agarwal and Kadilkar, and each growth chart has the advantage and disadvantage. And I'm not going into the detail about all the growth charts. And so whichever convenient, better to use it. And before planting into the growth chart, we have to calculate about the mid-parental height. So by fathers and mother heights, you divide by 2 and add 6.5 for boys and minus 6.5 for girls. And so you can see that you can plot serially in the growth chart, and here you target height or mid-parental height, you can plot it so that we may anticipate the expected height, what is going to happen in the children. And for height velocity also is one of the important tool to note whether it is a recent onset short stature or it is a chronic short stature. So you can see that the child is growing normally in the initial phase, and subsequently the crossing the centile from 50th centile to 25th and is a third centile. So that is a crossing of the centiles. It is one of the most significant factors that some recent pathology for short stature is going on. So growth velocity is one of the important tool to determine the height velocity, so we can pick up the child at the early stage of life. And you can see that this the right hand side growth chart is a short stature with underweight. You can see here that the short stature with overweight. So the growth chart also has the weight. Hence, it is a dual purpose. We can use it, the growth chart. And so the short stature can be diagnosed as a single point measurement, defined as already told, the 3 standard deviations or 5th percentile below the mean, or the serial growth monitoring. Hence, the two way we can assess the short stature. And the common causes of short stature may be a familial or constitutional delay, malnutrition, or chronic illnesses, or steroid intake, and obesity with the short stature. As already told that the constitutional delay as well as the familial, they may be growing in the normal phase lesser than the normal populations, but still they will go in a periodic or serial way. Whereas pathological short stature, they will cross the centiles. So the growth chart, one of the simple and easily available tool, we can predict where the child stands on. And subsequently, the short stature can be divided into a pathological short stature with the dysmorphic features or no dysmorphic features. And with the dysmorphic features, There are a lot of syndromes are available, and I will be going some of the syndromes in the subsequent slides. And you can see that disproportionate short stature and many of the skeletal dysplasias, disproportionate short stature, like achondroplasias, Albright hereditary dystrophy, like that. And I think this is some other slides. Just a minute, I think you also share the slides and some of the pictures I have heard it in there. Just a minute. We will proceed this in some technical errors. So disproportionate short statures, you can see that there may be a skeletal dysplasias and I think it's skeletal dysplasias. There may be a lot of hypochondroplasias and achondroplasias, and there may be a hypophosphatemic rickets. All are happen. And achondroplasia is one of the most common form of disproportionate short stature. And recently, one of the drug has been approved, ocirotide, and it is around 2 centimeter per year. There may be the height gain velocity has. And disproportionate short stature can be divided into more than the upper segment, and the lower segment is the more. And the mucopolysaccharidosis is one of the most common of predominant the lower segment comparing the upper segment short stature. And hence the etiology can be classified into normal variants and various genetic disorders like syndromes, Noonan, Turner's, and skeletal dysplasias and Prader-Willi, and subsequently the endocrine cause of short stature. And if you ruled out all other causes, then it is known as a idiopathic short stature. And this is one of the series from our this thing. So the familial and constitutional is correlate around 50 to 60% of the short stature, and maybe idiopathic around 2-3%, and small for gestation age is around 2%. And coming to the evaluation of short stature, as already told that the date of birth and bone age is one of the important clue, and subsequently the etiological evaluations. Coming to the bone age, we can use it the groin and pile, and the left hand of the wrist, it is the best site to determine the bone age comparisons. And so based on the chronological age, we have to plot the what is the patient's height age and chronological age and height age and subsequently bone age. So the bone age will be delayed in almost all causes of endocrine cause of short stature, whereas the bone age will be normal in skeletal dysplasia. So the bone age will be one of the important clue where the patient is stands on. That is to rule out other causes of short stature. From the height age, we have to calculate what is the height age, and the weight age also we can calculate to assess any malnutrition or other thing we are dealing. Coming to the endocrine cause of short stature, there may be a thyroid rickets and Cushing syndromes and pseudo hypoparathyroidisms. Coming to the basic workup, and one should not forget to rule out the systemic illness, because whenever the underlying systemic illness, the growth hormone alone doesn't have the magic role, and it can be a complete hemogram you can do because of anemia, pancytopenia, or aplastic anemia, and some thalassemia. So everything will produce short stature. So the complete hemogram with the peripheral shunting is one of the important first line management investigations. And complete urine analysis whenever you do rule out the renal tubular acidosis. So the urine pH or urine glucose and phosphate, it's a very important thing. Blood glucose and renal function test and liver function test. And whenever the features of rickets is there, then calcium phosphate and alkaline phosphatase. And then come to the endocrine investigations like thyroid hormones and other things. And ABG in suspected case of renal tubular acidosis. And if you suspect Turner's, then karyotype, and skeletal survey in case of achondroplasias. So based on the urine pH and serum potassiums, you can classify it as a proximal or distal RTA. and when to consider growth hormone deficiency. So whenever the short stature is very severe, like less than 3 standard deviations or poor growth velocities, and whenever it is a proportion short stature, and when there is no chronic illnesses or delayed bone age, and all other investigations are normal, then you suspect the growth hormone deficiency. So how to proceed whenever growth hormone deficiency is there? There will be always the bone age will be delayed, and the IGF-1 is one of the screening tests, but the sensitivity is very poor and the cost is high, and it is almost the sensitivity is around 60%, whereas in acromegaly, IGF-1 is the sensitivity is 95%. So the IGF-1, even though it is a less sensitive and it is one of the screening tool, we can use it. And the gold standard is a GH stimulation test. So the random GH is a useless test. And in endocrinology, any deficiency, we have to do stimulation test, and any hormonal excess, the suppressant test is required. Hence, the growth hormone deficiency, the gold standard will be the growth hormone stimulation test. Among the growth hormone stimulation test, insulin tolerance test is the best one because of the hypoglycemia risk, and many of the centers in India not doing. And the basic behind that is we have to make the child by hypoglycemia, since growth hormone is one of the counter-regulatory hormone. By maintaining glucose less than 40, the growth hormone will start rising. That is the basic pathogenic mechanisms. And subsequently, the clonidine stimulation test is the most commonly used drugs in almost all centers. It is a 4 microgram per kg clonidine, and you can 0-minute growth hormone sample, 60, 90 or 120 minutes. But the 60 and 90 is the predominant, the peak which is going to happen. And simultaneously glucagon also is available and we can do, but it is more commonly being done in children with less than 3 years of age. So the timing, as already told, and priming with sex hormone. So whenever you are planning to do growth hormone levels at the pubertal age group, the priming will be ideal because we are doing it with the estrogen rich environment. Estrogen is again one of the hormones for maintaining the statures. And if already 2 pituitary hormone deficiency is there, there may not be recurring stimulation test. And a lot of genetics have been evolved in the short stature. So the combined pituitary hormone deficiency and isolated growth hormone deficiency, the consanguinity history is more important. Many of the times both the dominant as well as the recessive has been described. This is one of the MRI imaging. You can see that this is the shallow pituitary with the empty sella, and the bright spot is situated in the ectopic, that is the stalk or hypothalamic area. So the shallow pituitary or empty sella with the ectopic bright spot, that is the one of the pathogenic consistent features in pituitary interruption syndromes. Coming to the last, that is a management aspect. And growth hormone almost available since the year of 1985. And subsequently, there is a lot of approved indications for growth hormone. But in India, still this is the most common indications. And subsequently, the small for gestational age, it is other approved indications. Other approved indications are Turner syndromes, Noonan syndromes, and so on. In skeletal dysplasias, this is not going to be very much useful, and sometimes there may be the growing of the bones in different directions. This is various dose range, and the growth hormone deficiency, they are very much sensitive state, and you can use it. This is the approved around 30 microgram per kg per day. That is the growth hormone deficiency state. Whereas in Turner syndromes or small for gestational age, they are relatively growth hormone resistant state. So we have to use higher dose comparing with growth hormone deficiency. So growth hormone deficiency child, they will very well respond to growth hormone. Whereas Turners and small for gestations, we have to use higher dose of growth hormones. And 1 milligram is equal to 3 international units. And the pen formulations may be a better options. And the efficacy of growth hormone depends on the diagnosis. So they will very well respond to growth hormone deficiency comparing with idiopathic short stature, and the least response to the Turners. And the age of starting treatment, if you start yearly, response going to be good, and dose requirement also very minimal, saving the cost also. And first year there is a huge response, and subsequent year there is a reductions in the response. And the age of attainment of puberty and the dosage we use appropriate dose, then response going good. And should not forget about treatment of coexisting hormone deficiency like thyroid and cortisol. And the genetics also has important role. And this is other variants of growth hormone. And we should always supplement other causes of short stature like thyroxine therapy as a lifelong in juvenile onset hypothyroidisms. Rickets, you supplement calcium and vitamin D, and always try to use the minimal steroid and estrogen supplementations in Turner's and treatment of chronic illnesses. And the summary and conclusion is the monitor height and weight at periodic interval in a growth chart. All short stature is not due to growth hormone deficiency, and use appropriate investigations when suspecting a case of short stature, and yearly identifications and intervention of short stature with appropriate therapy will normalize the height. So with that, I'm concluding my presentations. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Sridhar, for that giving us the clinical approach to short stature. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then move on to the next one. Now, you mentioned about this height standard deviation, less than 2 standard, 3 standard deviation. So how do you calculate the height standard deviation?
So again, we need the growth chart. So based on the height SDS, standard deviation score, and we have to, from the parental height, we can calculate the standard deviations. Again, for a simple way, there is a separate table formulations is available. And so based on the table formulations and the calculations from the growth chart, and we can standard deviation score, that is known as a SDS, we can calculate from the table easily, comparing with the thing. But I don't find a significant difference between this the serial velocity as well as the mid-parental height as well as the target height and the standard deviation score. Anyway, many of the studies, they used comparing the treatment response based on the standard deviation score, as well as some studies they used the IGF-1 model also based on the thing. But in our populations, the simple growth chart and height velocity itself will give you good clinical correlations for monitoring the growth hormone therapy.
There is one question in the chat box. Dr. Vinod has asked how to correct height for rickets patient with bowed legs. Apart from rickets treatment, anything else you do for height correction?
Actually, this is since there is a bowing of the limbs, and predominantly we have to use the length rather than the height. And while calculating the length, we have to use the separate from head to pubic symphysis and pubic symphysis to the lower end of the femur, then femur to heel, like that we have to take. So the length may be an appropriate thing to calculate the height, comparing the height. And so first you treat the rickets, and since if it is a simple rickets, they usually they will normalize the height. Only in resistant rickets, we may finding difficulty, and many of the times they may not able to have adequate height. But many of the studies, the hypophosphatemic rickets, the growth hormone also have been used for the height velocity. And so the priority and underlying clinical situations and the cost, then we can decide it.
Okay. Thank you, Sridhar. We will close this session. I hand over to Dr. S. Ram Kumar to invite the next speaker.
So, good morning, everybody. I now invite Dr. Bharat. Dr. Bharat is an endocrinologist in Chennai. He is currently working as a medical director and endocrinologist in North Coast Center for Hormonal Chennai in Adyar and Anna Nagar. He is also the treasurer of ESGN. I now invite Dr. Bharat for his talk on.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Must I share the screen? So is my screen visible?
So your screen video is visible. The slides are not shown, sir.
Slides are not visible.
Sir, you can. There is
Yep.
screen
Just a
sharing option will be there.
Yeah, I am going to that.
Yes, Dr. Sridhar switched off his share screen.
I have,
Yes.
I will log out and I will log in here. It will be better.
There would be a share screen option next to the chat button.
Yeah.
Yes, so now it's visible.
Is it visible now?
Yeah.
So the topic given to me is adolescent obesity, how to tackle in current pandemic situation. So this being the penultimate talk of Trendo 2020, and we had a fantastic scientific feast for the past 3 days. So our secretary has rightly given a social topic at the end of the talk so that we can close it in a lighter way. Nevertheless, we know very well that adolescent obesity is a really, sometimes it becomes very frustrating to manage patients because it needs a lot of talking and feedbacks and reinforcements, those kind of things. So we really have a pandemic. We have two pandemics which are colliding with each other now. So we have already a pandemic of obesity in our population, and then we have got this COVID-19, which started in a big way from March 2020 onward. So when two pandemics collide, naturally we become like a lame horse sitting in between the two pandemics, like in this photo. We don't know what to do. Really, we are alarmed and we are worried, stressed. So many things come to play a major role in the management. And talking about the obesity management, the obesity management itself is a difficult task to do in majority of our patients. When you talk about adolescent obesity, still it's very difficult because in that period, we know very well that anything you tell them to follow, it's very difficult for them to adhere to. And talking about adolescent management during pandemic situation is still finding, I think we are sitting a very, very small area, sitting at the bullseye kind of thing, which is going to be rather a very difficult task for all of us. So the thing is, how I'm going to place this talk is that I'm going to just discuss three things. One is the impact of obesity on COVID-19 infection. That's the first part of my talk. Second is impact of COVID-19 pandemic on obesity and how we are going to tackle the twin situation of obesity and COVID-19. So from pause to play, how we are going to proceed. That will be the agenda for my talk. So let's concentrate on the impact of obesity on COVID-19 infection first. So there are n number of articles there in the last 6 or 8 months regarding the COVID-19 infection, and we have got enough of talk about how COVID-19 infects us and all. I don't want to go into all those details once again. Coming to the area of our discussion, that is adolescent obesity and COVID. Just three data I'm going to show you. The first data which I'm going to show you was published in August 2020. And they showed that obesity and immunodeficiencies, these are the two main pre-existing conditions associated with mild to moderate COVID-19 infection in children. The other pre-existing conditions are not that significant. If you say the prevalence ratio, if you look at the prevalence ratio of COVID-19 children who have a moderate infection, probably the prevalence ratio is more for the immunodeficiency and the obesity part. You can take SARS-CoV infection, or you can take the COVID pneumonia, or you can also take the hospitalization. You can see that the bold numbers indicate either it's an immunodeficiency or it's an obesity. So you take any kind of category of COVID-19 infection in children and adolescents, obesity and immunodeficiencies are the two major and important pre-existing conditions. So the next data which I am going to show you is published from US, and they have mainly looked at the admissions, the COVID-19 admissions to intensive care units, especially in very young individuals. Again, they included some adolescents also in that. And they found out that there was a negative correlation between body mass index and age in 265 patients. That means the younger the age of the patient who is getting admitted in the intensive care unit, they are having a higher BMI. So we are getting younger and younger patients hospitalized for COVID infection with a higher BMI. That means we are having an exponential risk, I would say, in managing these patients with COVID-19 infection. So the third data which I'm going to show is COVID-19 infection and mortality, especially among obese young individuals. So this was published again in May 2020, and they have taken the following factors into account. The factors which you can see on the left side of the graph are the BMI, CRP, lymphocytes, eosinophils, albumin, and cardiac troponin and prothrombin time. So among all these factors, to the right corner, if you see, there are high risk factors. Only I would say that the three factors are having a high risk, which is predisposing them to a higher mortality. One is the body mass index, second one is the cardiac troponin, and third one is the prothrombin time. So cardiac troponin and prothrombin time, we know they are all biochemical criteria. So if you look at the clinical criteria focusing on adolescents, young adults with COVID-19 infection, I would say that BMI is the only thing which increases the mortality and morbidity in those individuals. So BMI is directly related to more hospitalization, more infections, and more kind of mortality. So we have n number of reasons why obesity or a higher BMI predisposes to COVID-19 infection, including the chronic inflammation, vitamin D deficiency, endothelial dysfunction, sleep disorders, and then there is a immunological response, dyslipidemia, prothrombotic state. All these things are theoretical risk why the obesity is predisposing a particular individual to the COVID-19 infection, especially a moderate to severe form. So coming to the next part of my talk, that is impact of COVID-19 on the obesity. So we have so far discussed how obesity impacts the COVID-19 infection. Now we are going to look at how COVID-19 pandemic has an impact on the higher BMI category. So just to summarize this one, I am going to just discuss this slide because everything is self-explanatory in this slide, and I don't want to go into much details beyond this slide because pandemic has created a pathway for us. We were into lockdown, now it's getting slowly released. Online learning is becoming more and more the way forward, and we had a lot of financial loss, fear, and stress. Probably these three things are the major contributory factor, I would say. Lockdown, we were in physical lockdown for initial 1 or 2 months, then it became a psychological lockdown also. As the fear grew, as the problems grew, it became more of a psychological issue also. So both physical and psychological issue, naturally, during the physical lockdown, we were not able to access any outdoor sports, fitness activities, and even an access to a doctor or a counselor who can counsel you for obesity management became very restricted for us. So because of that, what happened is that there was a lack of stimulus. Even in children or adolescents who wanted to start a lifestyle modification measures, they were not able to do, and who were already doing that, they were not able to maintain that measures. And because of the restricted access to doctors and counselors, there was a neglect in the treatment of comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia, if at all a child or an adolescent has it. So these things contributed for a more weight gain and susceptibility to severe infections. Naturally, on the lighter note, online learning became the way. Still, it is the way for our children and adolescents, and there is a prolonged sitting and screen time for them at home. And so naturally, what happens? The only thing that they go around now is to the kitchen. From hall to kitchen they go, In kitchen, they want to see several dishes being made and they go into the YouTube, Facebook. So nowadays, when you say open your YouTube or Facebook, you will be getting only pop-ups of how to make paneer butter masala simply at home or how to make a palak paneer at home. So these are the dishes which you are getting to see. And what happens is that people make delicious high calorie dishes at home just to avoid a boredom, which leads on to binge eating and weight gain. Again, financial loss, it's been there worldwide. Fear and stress has been there worldwide. And the stress enhanced inflammation and stress enhanced immune response that again indirectly leads on to more weight gain and susceptibility to severe infection. So there are multiple factors which are having an impact on the increase in the BMI and also increase in the susceptibility to infection. So this is the next step, that is how COVID-19 causes obesity, increased risk of obesity. I have already described all these things in my previous slide. So this completes the picture now, that obesity leading on to COVID-19, COVID-19 leading on to obesity, it becomes a vicious cycle. And our role is to stop this vicious cycle, and that's how we can play a role as physicians will be the next part of my talk. That is how we are going to tackle this twin pandemic, how we are going to play a safer game. That's what it's all about. So the current COVID scenario, if you look at, we have got certain good things which are happening in the last 2 months, I would say. Because previously when we were in a lockdown in March, April and May, we even didn't know what is all going to happen. So now our knowledge and understanding about the COVID-19 infection has improved significantly in the last 8 months, I would say. Second issue is that even the public health system was quite at shock when the COVID-19 started. Now the public health system also has started understanding that only mask wearing, social distancing and usage of soaps and sanitizers is going to help us to control the pandemic. And that has spread to the public awareness related things also. So public also have become more and more aware that these are the issues. These are the only things which are going to protect us from the pandemic. Of course, vaccine is there on the trial basis. So we don't know when we'll get it. We should get it sooner, I hope. Lesser number of cases are found in Tamil Nadu and Puducherry, at least for the time being nowadays. And because of that, we are getting lesser restrictions. So 2-3 months back, we were not able to go out at all. Nowadays, we are able to go out with some restrictions. And even the swimming pools are getting opened in Tamil Nadu from next week probably. And even some gym related activities and outdoor activities have started happening. And so this situation is a good thing for us regarding the COVID-19 scenario now. But there are some downsides still we are having, because the mask usage and social distancing, though people know that very well, it's not being strictly followed in some places. So we are really worried. The parents are really worried as to how to send their children to some place where they can get an access to a play or sports activity, because nobody is following mask and social distancing in those places. That kind of a fear is still there with the parents and with the general public. More indoor social gatherings are happening now, and we know very well that outdoor gatherings or outdoor activities are much safer in terms of COVID-19, because you can follow social distancing, you can follow a non-contact sports activities, you can also have a good airflow, ventilation, whereas it cannot be there in an indoor social gathering. So the spread of virus can be more in an indoor social gathering. Even though some schools have opened in some states, but there is still a persistence of online learning. Children are still glued to their tabs or computers for a longer period of time, though government has given the guidelines of how to conduct those things. And exams are around the corner. So in the next 2-3 months, they'll be facing exams, and there is more chance that children will get glued to their tabs and computers in the next 2-3 months. So how we are going to manage this thing is a great problem. Some states have started showing a second peak, but still it has not happened in Tamil Nadu or Puducherry, thank God, and we hope that it should not happen. So in this kind of a scenario, what is the physician's role in managing a twin pandemic? The only thing what we can do is, we have got a problem, but that problem itself we can convert it into a boon. We can motivate the children more so that we can disseminate the knowledge well, and we can have a better control of at least the racing BMI. So the main thing as a physician, what we should do, I think, is the knowledge dissemination among parents, because parents are more apprehensive nowadays to even send the children, even stepping out of the home itself is becoming quite a difficult one. So parents have to be counseled regarding the good practices they should follow, at the same time the practices they should avoid if their children want to play in the terrace or something. So innovative ideas are the second thing. That's the point which we have to discuss with the children and the parents. I'll talk about the innovative ideas in detail in my next few slides, but it's not going to be innovative, though I have put it as an innovative idea. Encourage the neighborhood participation in apartments, because nowadays there are close community groups in many of the places in Chennai, and most of the apartments have strictly prevented even entry of even delivery boys into their apartments. They have to strictly follow the protocol. So in that kind of a situation, the neighbors within the apartment itself can be encouraged to have some part, at least some good sports activities. Because in Chennai and all, there is a good saying that we don't know even our neighbors, but because of the pandemic, we are knowing our neighbors very well, because that's one thing. We are getting bored at home and we step out and see that, okay, he's our neighbor, she's our neighbor, and we are able to have a useful interaction with them. Probably that has to be taken as an advantage, and we have to proceed further. And since we are focusing more on the e-learning, how to incorporate the health practices in e-learning is one thing which we have to discuss. And a regular reinforcement of all these things through video calls, SMS, and WhatsApp messages is another thing that we have to discuss, because nowadays the WhatsApp consultations have become a norm, video consultations have become a norm. So that thing can be taken as an advantage so that we can reinforce the patient at home itself. They can have a healthy practices starting at their home. We are able to see their home in our video consultations and all. We are able to understand them in a much better way, so that we can have innovative ideas physicians can give them at home itself. They will be also more receptive now in using the e-learning process and in using the video calls to have a positive feedback on what they do. So innovative ideas, when I talked about the innovative ideas, it's innovative, I told you. It's just bringing back the forgotten past, because we would have never gone to our terrace in the apartment for several years. Now it's a time to go to the terrace, so that we need not go outside and all. Some fun-filled non-contact sports activities can be done, which can be effectively good for the children, because when the apartment children see each other doing that activities, they will also be positively encouraged. Even if a doctor tells them 1,000 times, they won't do that. But if their peer group, the neighborhood child is doing some skipping or something, they will also be encouraged to do that activity. And that's a good feedback, I would say. Gardening, if you have a garden, please encourage your children to involve in the gardening activities. You also do it at home, so that gardening gives them a good environmental understanding about how the basic gardening can be done. That's a good pastime also, and it will also prevent a boredom. Cooking with kids and involving kids in the working day-to-day home related activities, because many people have stopped maids for several months now. So involve your kids in sweeping, cleaning house, cleaning utensils, even in cooking. They'll also be happy. Initially they'll be reluctant, but finally to avoid boredom, they'll come to the kitchen and start doing some activity. In fact, my children have started doing all these things for the past 6 months. I'm really happy about that. Jumping rope exercise or skipping is one thing which I always encourage for my adolescents, because that's a very simple and an effective way which can be done at home or in the terrace to have a calorie loss, at least in the initial part of time. So this is just a photo to show my apartment kids engaging in some fun-filled leisure activities during the time of this COVID-19. Of course, you can see that they are all wearing the mask, but they are involved in some good activities, which gives a positive reinforcement for each of them. So how to integrate the online learning along with the health? Instead of going into some vague kind of websites, there are certain websites which give you a good idea about how you can do a gardening with kids, how you can do cooking with kids, how you can involve in sports activities, food games with the kids, and how you can use a healthy recipes at home. So these are some of the websites which I have given. I suppose you can go into the website and you can search yourself. So these things you can see along with your kids, so that kids also get to know which is healthy, which is unhealthy, and you can use the e-learning process into such a fruitful one. Even there are certain websites which give you an idea of how you can do a physical activity at home, and what is the ideal level of physical activity, what are the various things you can do at home, being active at home. So there are so many websites into that, and instead of going into some YouTube kind of thing, you can ask the children to view these things. You can also view along with them, so that children will get an encouragement. So coming to the last part of my talk, pharmacotherapy. This is just, I am doing it for a completion sake, I would say, the pharmacotherapy, because it has been there even before the COVID time and it's still there. But regarding the adolescent and childhood obesity, pharmacotherapy has got a limited role to play, that we all know very well. The approved indicated pharmacotherapy are orlistat, phentermine. Of course, there are certain lag points, certain side effects in all these things. We should be able to understand these things before we prescribe these things to our kids. Non-approved, non-FDA approved drugs are also available, like metformin and topiramate. Among this, probably metformin we are using more commonly in our kids. Exenatide and liraglutide, GLP-1 analogs, injectables are picking up in a great way. Many physicians I have seen using them for obesity in kids even below 18 years of age, though it's not an FDA approved indication. So among these things, probably what we can use is metformin or orlistat, which is a more safer approach if you want to do a pharmacotherapy along with the lifestyle modification measures for children and adolescents with obesity. So the take home message, the physician's role will be awareness creation for parents, awakening the kids from the slumber, because kids have gone into a slumber because of a prolonged lockdown and e-learning and the computers, and also we have to really do an awakening for them by giving some innovative ideas. You have to use the technology, because technology is ruling the world now. So that technology has to be used positively for a reinforcement technique, and also through your video calls, through your consultations, video consultations, give a good medical and psychosocial support for them, so that they don't feel that the doctor is away and we will not be able to access. And they also feel that, okay, doctor is looking at us very keenly, so that we should do something and we should give an encouraging result to him. So with this, I conclude my talk, and I thank this opportunity given to me by the organizers of the Trendo 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat. It was an informative lecture. I think it's more of a social content. I think I'd be happy if you could come and give the same talk again to our Apollo Children's Hospital also. So if there are any questions, Dr. Sivan, are there any questions?
Yeah, you said, Dr. Bharat, you said this obese patients are susceptible to COVID infection. Are they susceptible to all infection, or are they susceptible specific to COVID?
I think this is a pediatrician's role to answer this question. Probably Ram Kumar will be able to answer very well, I think.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's only thing I can remember is that only COVID-19. I think it's related to obesity. Not sure. There could be other maybe fungal infections or other infections. But I think only thing which we recently were strongly attributing obesity to infection is this COVID-19. Not sure if there are other infections.
Yeah, because I was also listening to some talks given for pediatric practitioners, especially because my wife is a pediatrician. She used to listen to talks on COVID-19. I'll also hear along with that. What I gathered from the speakers is that, see, even though we talk about the COVID-19 infection, in children it is not still very severe kind of thing compared to adult population. What they generally say is that children still get away with that milder form of disease, asymptomatic form of disease when compared to adults. But in obese children, there is a little more risk when compared to a lean child. So probably I would say that this is a golden opportunity for us to impress upon these kids, so that you please stay away but at the same time you do something to control your BMI.
And most of the obesity is lifestyle related. but when should a practitioner suspect some underlying cause, and when should we decide to investigate or refer a patient? What are the clinical pointers where they should suspect some underlying problem etiologically?
See, the concept of the childhood or adolescent obesity, if we discuss pertaining to that, because the topic is for adolescent obesity. See, a careful history taking is all that we should do. One thing. Second thing, as previously mentioned by the previous speaker, Dr. Sridhar, putting a growth chart for these children. That will help us in a long way to know whether this obesity is really due to the lifestyle related issue or it's an endocrine issue. So these two things are the most important thing. History taking, do a growth chart, do a growth monitoring, height, weight monitoring, height, age, weightage estimation. And then next step is go for other systematic examination to know whether there is any other syndromic features related to that, like a polydactyly or like faces, typical faces of a Prader-Willi syndrome, those kind of things. Like so, history taking itself will take care of most of the issues. When you plot in a growth and if you see that height is very less than third centile, weight is at 95th centile kind of thing, and the child is not picking up at height at all, if you mark the growth velocity, and if you look at the bone age, grossly delayed kind of a bone age, these things should give you a clue as to whether this is an endocrine cause and you should investigate, specifically look into the hypothyroidism part and the Cushing's part, those kind of things. And of course, syndromic part, it's very difficult to diagnose unless you know the specific syndromes and you look at the specific features, clinical features of the syndrome.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ramkumar?
I think there are no more questions, sir. So we can go to the next talk.
Okay. And we have the introductory slide for Dr. Arun Vishwanath. Dr. Arun Vishwanath.
Hello, hi, sir.
Hi. Yes, he's done his DM endocrinology from Kashmir. He has traveled from, he is from southern part of India, Tirunelveli, and he has traveled to the northern tip of India to get his DM endocrinology. And he is currently consultant endocrinologist at Tirunelveli. He has several publications in national and international journals. We invite him to give his talk on approach to delayed puberty. Over to Dr. Arun Vishwanath.
Everyone, I'm audible?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for the kind words.
Can share your screen.
Because of weather, actually, I'm having some difficulty in connecting, sir. So,
Can share your screen.
yes, sir. Actually, I'm having slight difficulty in connecting here.
So do you want us to share your slides and you can present?
Yeah, that would be better, sir.
Okay, I'll just show your slides then. And whenever you want to move to the next slide, please just say next and we'll move to the next slide for you. Can you see the slide, sir?
Yes,
Yeah,
slides absolutely.
You can see the slides. Dr. Arun?
Dr. Arun, the slides are visible. You can proceed with your presentation.
So I think he might be rejoining again because of an internet issue. So we can just wait for a couple of minutes. till he rejoins.
Okay. If there are any questions in short stature and obesity, maybe we can take it up till he joins. Sridhar, you are available?
Maybe we can have a discussion on delayed puberty. Dr. Ram Kumar,
Yes, sir.
maybe we can have in the meanwhile.
Maybe we can ask Dr. Bharat and Dr. Sridhar to unmute so that we can make it as a panel discussion. Dr. Bharat and Dr. Sridhar.
No, they can also be part of the panel discussion.
Yes.
Dr. Bharat.
We can start with some questions.
Yeah.
Start with Dr. Bharat. So when should you make a diagnosis of delayed puberty in a boys and girls? Is there any age cutoff, and at what point you should be making a diagnosis clinically? Dr. Bharat.
Yeah. Delayed puberty, I would say that it's a puberty. We know it's a long process. It starts at around 11, 12 years of age. Even before that, we can say if you go into the in-depth into the adrenarche and things and all, probably it starts even earlier than what we generally see. The visualization of pubertal signs we'll be seeing maybe at 11 and up. But the biochemical changes, the GnRH stimulation and the hypothalamic stimulation starts even earlier for the children. Adrenarche, in fact, the adrenarche starts at even 6, 7 years of age in several children. So puberty is a process. It's not one event which is we are talking about. It's a several events. Culmination of the event is that the child, from a childhood, the person goes into a fully grown adult, a male or a female. So, but when you talk about the cutoff for delayed puberty, I would say that cutoffs are slightly different for a male and female. Female, I would say that if there is a failure of initiation of the puberty, you can do in two ways. You can call a delayed puberty if it has started, but it has not happened, it has not gone to the full phase, or it has started, but it has not started at all. Okay, so the onset is delayed or the onset is normal, the progression is delayed. So these are the two things which we should take into account. When you tell about the onset, I would say that for a male, maybe 14 years, I would say as a cutoff, when we call as really a delayed puberty, even if you're not seeing any sign of puberty in that individual, or for a girl, if you say a 13-year, we can take as a cutoff if there is no sign of puberty, or if the completion of the entire pubertal process has not happened within the 5 years from the onset of the first time. So these are the two things which we should always look into account, because many times we can have an onset at the right time, but there will be an arrested puberty at some point of time due to some pathology. So whether the onset is delayed or the progression is getting delayed, the cutoff may vary. Maybe a 13-year for a girl, 14-year for a boy, and the progression should be within the 5 years from the onset of the first clinical sign.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll ask Dr. Ram Kumar, what is the use of bone age in these patients with delayed puberty? What if it is low and what if it is normal, or what if it is elevated? How to interpret bone age in delayed puberty?
Sorry, I think the charge is less. Okay. I think common scenario is either the bone age will be normal or the bone age will be delayed. Very unlikely to have a bone age that is advanced and you still have a delayed puberty. That may be in rare exceptions like the untreated CAH who has advanced to bone age, but because of the high androgen levels, the puberty is not starting. I don't think any other reasons why you have a bone age which is advanced, but you still have delayed puberty. The most common scenario is a delayed bone age, because as Dr. Bharat said, the usual cutoff I take as 13, 14, 15. Easy to remember. 13 for a telarchy in a girl, and 14 for a gonadarchy in a boy, and 15 for a menarche. So this is the usual cutoff that we take for evaluation. And so if someone is beyond 13 years and still they have not entered puberty, and if their bone age is delayed, then there is a possibility that it could be a CDGP. So I think in many of these cases, we can just reassure the parents that maybe if the bone age advances to around 13 or 4 in a girl or 14 in a boy, that puberty can kickstart spontaneously, and if still it does not kickstart, then we can go for the evaluation. Because the main concern is if it is a gonadal involvement, like a testicular or a ovarian, that biochemical reports may show up. But if it is a hypothalamic pituitary involvement, the reports may not show. So it is very difficult to differentiate CDGP and hypogonadism. So we have to wait for the bone age, or sometimes we may have to do a GnRH stimulation test, like to confirm or exclude, but still most of these completely exclude hypogonadism. Bone age is delayed, we have to just choose around 13 in a girl or 14 in a boy, and then still if the parents want to definitely confirm the diagnosis, then we can go ahead with the GnRH stimulation testing.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bharat, there are so many GnRH analogs available, and GnRH is not available at present. So what is the common protocol you follow? Which GnRH analog you use for stimulation, and what cutoffs you take?
As Dr. Ramkumar pointed out, see, in a delayed puberty, if a boy is there, the main thing that we will consider is a constitutional delay in growth and puberty, which is the most common cause still in majority of the boys with puberty. Second thing is, in a girl with a delayed puberty also, we are nowadays seeing more of constitutional delay in girls also, but still it is common in boys. So whenever when a child comes within the cutoff range of a delayed puberty, the next step, as Dr. Ramkumar pointed out, is getting a bone age, getting a basic hormonal profile. So getting a bone age will help us to give an idea as to whether this bone age is delayed or whether this bone age is appropriate. And most of the times the bone age will be delayed, either it's grossly delayed or it's appropriate for the height age. That thing we have to see. So if the bone age and height age are almost the same, but for the chronological age it is delayed, means most likely it can be still be a constitutional delay in puberty. And there is a gross delay in bone age along with the delay in puberty, we'll think about the pathological causes, especially to rule out some pathological causes of delayed puberty. We generally take the gonadotropin hormones, the FSH and LH hormone. We do at estradiol levels in a girl or a testosterone level in a boy. Though estradiol testosterone levels will give us some idea, GnRH, the FSH and LH, gonadotropin hormones, the gonadotropins, FSH and LH will give us a better idea. And of course, thyroid function test always has to be done, because thyroid function test problems can also happen in these children. So based on the LH, FSH and the testicular ovarian hormone, we can come to a fair idea about what is happening in this kid. If the LH, FSH has not increased, it's suppressed, then it's more towards a constitutional delay or a hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. Suppose the LH, FSH is elevated, we have our issue is mostly solved, because if LH, FSH is grossly elevated, especially FSH, that means the child has a hypergonadotropic hypogonadism. So there we are not going to use a GnRH stimulation test. Only in a situation where the LH, FSH is really low and the child has not picked up the puberty, we are worried whether it's a hypogonadotropic hypogonadism or a constitutional delay in puberty. GnRH test, there are several protocols. You can use a GnRH stimulation test. You can use a HCG stimulation test. Even in HCG stimulation test, you have got a short HCG stimulation test, a long HCG stimulation test. So there are at least 3 or 4 kind of protocols are there to do a GnRH stimulation test. You have pointed out very well that the GnRH is not available freely nowadays. HCG is available. You can do a HCG stimulation test also. I would say that a baseline LH and FSH gives us a very good clue in majority of the individuals, because we would have seen that the child's testicular volume is 3 ml. Suppose the boy is coming to us or a girl is coming to us with no signs of puberty, no thelarchy, no breastbud formation and all. Suppose if the LH value is crossing 0.5 in a robust assay, I would say, that means that some form of pubertal induction is happening biochemically, though it is not getting reflected in the clinical features. So a baseline LH, baseline FSH itself will give us a good clue. Only in situations where you want to rule out a hypogonadotropic hypogonadism versus a constitutional delay in puberty, you go for a GnRH or a HCG stimulation test. Even in GnRH, you are not going to use a long-acting analog, only the short-acting GnRH, that is the immediate release GnRH should be used. If it's not available, you can use that. But if it's available, you have to use the immediate release, that 1 milligram GnRH, leuprolide is generally used. But I would say that a baseline is more enough, and we should always remember that none of these tests, neither the HCG stimulation nor the GnRH test, will clearly distinguish its hypogonadotropic hypogonadism from a constitutional delay. And even in hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, there is a point of concept called a reversal of hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, which is clearly proven even in genetically established causes of hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. So all I would say is that if a child is having a low gonadotropin level, follow up the child, keep both the diagnosis open, both hypogonadotropic hypogonadism and constitutional delay. Only a follow-up will be able to give you a better answer than using any kind of a test. Of course, tests are really helpful, but not in every situation.
Okay. Should we go ahead? I think Dr. Arun Vishwanath has joined. Dr. Arun Vishwanath, are you available? Dr. Arun? Dr. Arun, are you available?
Um, Hello, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes. Do you have your
Oh,
slides?
sorry for the interruption, sir.
So do you want us to start your slideshow then, and you can start presenting?
Yeah, that'll be better.
Can you see your slides, sir?
Yeah,
Okay, so please just let us know whenever
I'm
you
able
want
to
us to move to the next slide.
yeah. I should delay puberty. Am I to next slide? Can you just switch on the
So we are not able to hear you properly.
Rahul, can you
Arun.
go on to the next slide?
Next. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually great people from to Pablo because have given multiple people to everyone.
Yes, Arun, you can proceed, Arun.
You can go to next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, items. Can anyone
Okay.
confirm? Yeah, the
Maybe
plan
I
of the
will.
presentation, definition of delay. Then I move on to am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the confirmation. Definition of delayed puberty. Then we'll see about the etiologies, what constitutes delayed puberty dilemma, how to differentiate between the CDG isolated hypertension, some case weakness. Next. Yeah, puberty, the definition like this is the absence of puberty appropriate progress. So, and the definition, we need to know what onset of puberty and by what expected to be the usual progression of puberty. The onset of puberty in boys testing of more than 3 particular length
Dr. Arun,
of centimeter.
Dr.
For
Arun,
clinical purposes are on the progression from stage 1 to genital stage 2 in the onset of puberty. So this that paper description was stage 1 is yeah. Which will be of same size and as childhood. While stage 2, the scrotum and there is a change in the content. There will also be a skin. So this change G1 to G2 constitutes the onset of puberty. Yes,
hello.
sir, you can be.
Yeah,
My audio is there.
yeah. Uh, just because of the poor reception, I think I will present the slides for him.
Yes, sir, Dr. Satish, you can do that, sir. Because
Yeah.
delayed puberty
Yeah.
is a common topic.
Yeah. So the onset of normal puberty is when we say it's the uh, uh, transition between B1 to B1 to B2 stage. Tanner staging is called starting of puberty in girls, and that is from the pre-adolescent stage. That is the elevation of papilla going on to the breast bud stage. Next. While you should not we should not take puberty is not considered as a delay in puberty is not considered as a definition for delayed puberty. Next. So the expected age of pubertal onset is varied between boys and girls. With regard to boys, it has a it is average age is 11 years with a standard deviation of 1 year. So meaning it can vary between anything between 9 years to nearly 13.5 years is the 95% confidence interval for onset of pubertal onset, wherein with the girls it is 11.15 to 1.1 years, meaning nearly starting from nearly 8.5 to something of 13 years of age. So this is arbitrary definition which is taken from the standard deviation for that particular given population. Next slide. So arbitrarily, it's, for boys, it's taken as 8 to 13.5, and for girls from 8.5 to 13. And standard textbooks will mention it as delayed once puberty is delayed by more than 14 years, and in girls by delayed by more than 13 years. Yeah. Next slide. There is a secular trend in the delay in the onset of age of puberty, and actually there is a progressive decrease in this age, and the possible reasons for this is increased adiposity, insulin resistance, physical inactivity, psychological factors, and changed dietary habits. Next slide. Should the age cutoffs for delayed puberty be lowered? It's a strict no. Next slide. When do we say there is a failure of progression of puberty? So the average duration of puberty is nearly 2 to 3 years. So if there is a failure of progression in this gap, if there is a progression beyond these time period, we can think about failure of progression of puberty. That's more apparent in girls than in boys. And this is onset of Tilaki to Menarche is the period we are looking at. While in boys, we are looking at the onset, that is the G2 to G5 stage. And if this puberty delay is more than 4 to 5 years, then it becomes significant and we take it as delayed puberty. Etiology of delayed puberty, we can think of 3 causes. Most common will be the constitutional delay of growth and puberty. Second will be the central pituitary hypothalamic hypogonadism. And third is the primary hypogonadism. These 3 are the commonest causes of delayed puberty. When you come to in the boys and girls, the differentiation, CDGP is the predominant cause in boys, while in girls, it's the primary hypogonadism, which is the most common cause. And the hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism accounts for nearly 30% in boys, transient in nearly 20%, and permanent in 10%. While in girls, it's transient in nearly 25% and permanent in 5 to 10%. Next. We will discuss about the constitutional delay of growth and puberty. There is it's a constitutional delay. We have to know that it's a constitutional delay and can be hence thought of as a benign variant of even normal growth. And nowadays there is a new term being advocated, that is self-limited delayed puberty. It's a most common cause of delayed puberty, and is a diagnosis of exclusion, and is underreported in girls. Though the pathogenesis is not clear, the timing of puberty, we have to know, is predominantly determined by heredity, and there is a nearly 50 to 80% heritability factor in this. Next slide. Long-term health implications. So stature comes to be slightly less than the genetic potential, and there is a long-term psychosocial impact, and there is a probable bone mineralization defect also. Next slide. Hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism, primarily involving mutations of gonadotropins or their receptors, and most common causes either the functional or organic defect. So this, we should remember, this is not the hypogonadotropic hypogonadism per se. We can think it of something like a functional hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. So organic defects can be something of isolated IHH, that is isolated hypogonadotropic hypogonadism with or without anosmia. Then with CPHD, that is combined pituitary hormone deficiencies. While functional defects, this is the commonest cause of this hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism. So any chronic disease can go on to have an impact on the hypothalamic axis and produce this hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism. Next slide. So one point to be remembered that Dr. Bharat had just highlighted this point. Kalman's is reversible in Kalman or even any normosmic variant. Hypogonadism is reversible in up to 10% of patients. Next slide. So primary hypogonadism, the commonest cause in boys is the Klinefelter. When in boys is Klinefelter, in girls it's the Turner syndrome. Next slide. And when you come to primary syndromes associated with hypogonadism, in the level of hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism, it's predominantly the Prader-Willi syndrome and the Bardet-Biedl syndrome. And with primary hypogonadism, it will be the Down syndrome and myopathies associated predominantly the myotonic dystrophy and progressive muscular dystrophy. Next slide. So when we come to evaluation of delayed puberty, we go to confirming the clinical cases and looking for the obvious causes, then classifying the type, whether it's hypergonadotrophic or hypogonadotrophic, and looking for the etiologies and determining the need for whether if it is CTGP, all we need to do is just wait and watch, and if it is other etiologies, we need to treat. Next slide. So when it comes to confirming the diagnosis, it becomes important to get the exact chronological age, the TANA staging, and the oxology. We need to say whether if they are eunuchnoid, and if they have isolated long legs, we are allowed to think of Klinefelter syndrome. And we need to also get bone age and see if bone age is also delayed. Next slide. So looking for obvious causes, anything of obvious causes we should not rule out. Namely, we told of any chronic systemic illness and any history of any CNS tumors or systemic conditions. And if there is a family history of CDGP has to be got, and apparent any syndromic features have to be sought, and any past history of genital surgery or octopexy also is to be looked into. Next slide. And we classify it into two types, namely primary hypogonadism, and other would be the secondary hypogonadism, namely the hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism. So for which, sorry, we need to get the basal gonadotropins, which if either low or low normal would indicate a hypothalamic pituitary cause, and if it is high would come to indicate a primary hypogonadism. The exception for this can involve the mutations in the gonadotropins and their receptors. Next slide. Looking for etiologies, we need to do karyotyping and ultrasound pelvis, and inhibin B can give additional information, and this is for primary hypogonadism. When it comes to hypothalamic pituitary hypogonadism, our main focus will be to look for pituitary and olfactory bulb in a MRI brain, and we have to test for olfaction. Standardize the testing avenues like UPSID method can be used. Then University of Pennsylvania smell testing is there, and other pituitary axis also need to be tested, commonly IGF-1. The common differential is IHH with CDGP. So the common differentiating features will be, there will be a strong family history in CDGP, and there will be a typical growth pattern, a sudden peak in growth velocity near the late pubertal age, and short stature prior. And with IHH, there are concomitant history of anosmia, midline defects, neurological features, renal and skeletal anomalies, lack of mini puberty, and incomplete puberty or arrested puberty. Next slide. So here we can see there is a there has been the curve goes below the third percentile. When it comes to around the age of 15, there is a sudden peak so that he reaches the 10th centile in the by the age 18 or 19. So this is a classic picture of CDGP. While on the other hand, with regard to IHH, the height is not a botheration for them. They will end up with normal height, or at a may end up with tall stature. Next. So CDGP, the classic pattern will be short stature representation, while a true IHH will have a normal stature, and a functional IHH will have a slowing of the growth rate. Next. So testing wise, we used dynamic testing, and we use GNRH stimulation testing, in which we have LH measured at 1, 2, and 4 hours, and we have the avenues of going for triptylene or leuprolide testing, and leuprolide the cutoff used is more than 5 international units per liter, and for testosterone at day 4 for HCG stimulation to be more than 100 nanogram per deciliter. Next slide. So the basal gonadotropin levels are not much useful when it comes to differentiation between CDGP and IHH. But a value of LH more than 0.65 favors CDGP, and a single value of inhibin less than 35 has a 100% negative predictive value for identifying IHH. Next slide. The hallmark for differentiating CDGP versus IHH is the presence of spontaneous pubertal onset, presence or absence of spontaneous pubertal onset by age of chronological age of 18, or a bone age of 13 to 14. Next slide. So whether to treat or not is determined by patients. How they perceive is the issue. The psychological impact is difficult to gauge. The indirect clues. Patient is not complex to lifestyle modification. Indirect clues are withdrawal from social activities, deterioration in academic performance, and exclusion in age-appropriate social avenues or sporting activities. Next slide. So a short course of sextirat is given, and that's to jumpstart the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. This is with any testo preparation around 50 to 100 milligrams IM once monthly for 3 to 6 months, and wait for the spontaneous onset of puberty for 3 to 6 months. However, the benefits due to this is a bit doubtful. Next. So in those with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, we can do pubertal induction, and that is we need to have a slow and steady approach to this. We start with a low dose steroids and slowly increase the dose over the next 2 years by having 6 monthly increments. Next slide. So when it comes to the pubertal induction in hypogonadism will involve starting of any testosterone preparation of 50 to 100 IM 1 milligrams IM once a month, gradually increased to a dose of 200 to 300 milligrams once in 4 weeks. When it comes to girls, the usual starting advised dose is to start with a estradiol valerate of 0.25 and slowly increasing it to a dose of 2. Progesterone is to be added once the breakthrough bleed occurs after Tanner stage 4 has developed. Next slide. So there are case vignettes which so this is a case of 16-year-old male who has poor height gain as well as facial immaturity. He had a bone age of 13 and a LH of 1.2, and MRI was normal, and pituitary axis also normal. Next slide. So just because his height is below the 3rd percentile, there is a possibility of CDGP here. Next slide. Here is a classic example of functional hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. Just because the patient has been on glucocorticoids for nephrotic syndrome, and this has affected the growth. Next slide. This is a 14-year-old 6-month girl with primary amenorrhea. She has no stigmata of Turner syndrome, has a height of 123 as against mid-parental height of 160, and LH baseline LH is 0.13 and bone age is 10. So what do we think in this case? Next slide. So here this particular case was a case of panhypopituitarism. So most probably with treatment of her hormonal deficit, there is to be the acceleration of her growth. Next slide. So in summary, delayed puberty has a significant emotional toll in both sexes. Confirm the diagnosis first and look for the obvious causes which are there. Most important is to allay the anxiety in the peripubertal children, and key diagnostic diagnostic avenue will be to use karyotype in primary hypogonadism, and for secondary hypogonadism we have to go in for MRI brain, and there is no foolproof test to differentiate between IHH and CDGP. Growth chart can be a key weapon in helping it, and a trial of low dose sex steroid can be tried. However, we can't vouch for it. And when you go in for pubertal induction, we have to go slow with sex steroids. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Satish Kumar, for taking over that. Sorry for the interruption. Since we are running out of time, we will close the session. I thank all the speakers. And the valedictory function and closing ceremony is going on in the Hall A. I request all to join Hall A. Thank you. Over to the organizers.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
everyone. Thank the speaker.